Hi, this is Roger. Thanks for dropping by. I'm going to kill two birds with one stone and combine my everything in bloom on the 8th on the 9th. I didn't get it done yesterday. I was busy and out most of the day, quite honestly. I had my meeting at the Highcliffe Castle in the morning and wander around there and a bit of breakfast and then I had an Orchid Society meeting in the afternoon. So, you know, it's an out day rather than a here in the grow room day. Yeah, so everything in bloom. I did say that coming up soon there might be one of these videos that's got next to nothing in it. Well, this is pretty close to next to nothing compared with some of the other months worth of blooms, but let's get going anyway. My Peter Comp spike lost a bloom, my fault, I knocked it. And the blooms on here are not going to last long. One's already fading. Yeah, there's still one bud to open, and it has got another spike over there. Now that's a Miltonidium. I'll get on to why I've actually mentioned what it is. As far as Oncidium types are concerned, if you can grow any of these, then you can definitely grow Peter Comp. It's a pretty easy going one. It's quite vigorous. Readily produces roots, so you know it's one that could be recovered relatively easy, and the fragrance is absolutely gorgeous on that, and quite powerful. And talking of fragrance, right next to it is Sherry Baby, and again an Oncidium hybrid in this case, that is very fragrant. And talk about luck of the draw, you know, whoever managed to do this cross and then saw the blooms and thought, no, they're not very spectacular, are they? But what's that fragrance? It smells of chocolate. What a lucky draw. You know, because I mean, you can't plan fragrance really. You can hybridize ones that are already fragrant and expect to get some fragrance, but you can't really predict what it's going to be. So that was just a lucky break for somebody when that cross was done. Whatever's in it, I don't know. So that's those two. My Oncidium varicosum, Roger's eye, balding, the name's about 8 foot long, isn't called that anymore. It's been reclassified completely, but I don't care, it keeps its original name. I didn't get it because it's got my name in it, I got it because I love the blooms, and that's never going to change. Out of all my Oncidium types, I would say that's probably the most spectacular bloom. Not for me, it's not a very vigorous plant. Tends to produce one new growth that matures and blooms. But I mean, when I got this, the spike was about 3 foot long, had branches on it, and probably had 30 odd blooms on it. I've never achieved that since I got it. I mean, when I repotted it, it dumped all its roots for a start. So, but nonetheless, I think that's my only Oncidium species. Apart from, no, Twinkles are hybrids, so yeah, I think that's my only Oncidium species. True Oncidiums anyway. What else have we got? Next to that is Dendrobium hibiki, doing very well. And I keep seeing versions of this popping up. There was one on the Orchid Society competition tables yesterday, and it had one cluster of blooms, probably less than the size of that, and it didn't have large canes like this either. It was quite a small plant really, but it was in bloom, and it was this colour. I did mention back at the Bournemouth Orchid Society meeting, there was a version there that was quite a deep purple, still with the orange, so it was actually quite a nice colour, and an unusual clone to be much darker than this. But although I liked it, I still prefer this. This is a colour I really haven't got much of at all. So anyway, it's been hanging on for an awful long time. The blooms are starting to fade now. These spikes down here, what I call the secondary spikes, they did not fare well in the heat. These opened before the heat really kicked off, so you know, these just didn't do anywhere near as well. Probably a hydration and heat combination thing, but that. Hang on. Right. Down here is the last bloom on Phalaenopsis Sweet Memory. This one's down on a lower shelf now. This was just getting too much light. The leaves were starting to get quite pale. They have started to darken up a bit now. But yeah, it was in too much light. But the spike is perfectly capable of extending yet again, and as are the branches. The main stem's already been cut once and then extended, and it looks like there's a bud there. This branch looks like it's got a bud, as does that branch. So there could be some more blooms down the line on this, but out of the 3 I've had for some considerable time, this is the last one left, and it is showing signs of fading now. The yellow tends to darken a little as it starts to fade, and that is fragrant, but for me it's not what I would call very fragrant. You've got to get pretty close, but the fragrance is pleasant, and nice patterning, nice colour combinations. Purple and yellow are not an ideal combination, but in flowers it just seems to work. And then you've got those tiny little red spots on it as well. So it's a lovely little Phalaenopsis, that one. Oof. Ow. What else have we got? Not a lot. My only Cattleya in bloom is not a good bloom at all, and quite a few people said that was probably heat damage. You know, where the bud was trying to expand and was just not getting enough hydration up through the plant, and as fast as it was getting hydrated, it was pouring out the top of the plant and getting lost, and I think the bud may have suffered. Nonetheless, it's his first bloom since I got it. I haven't had this plant long. That's it's Cattleya harrisoniana, and it's actually a hybrid, and it's 2 named clones crossed together, which presumably are unregistered because it hasn't got a new name, which it ought to have really. So it's Harrisoniana Volcano Queen crossed with Harrisoniana Binot. Yeah, but they're both species named clones. So effectively it is still a species, just named varieties of that species. This Miltonia, I think, is now on its last, yeah, there's no more bud. So this is the last bloom, and this was a colour, this is Miltonia Queen Anne. This was a colour variable one. So on the same spike I had ones with quite an amount of white on the lip, and some with next to none. But it's a nice deep purple. But the colours are what I call dull. They look like watercolours, you know, as opposed, there's no sheen on it at all. So pastel shades, but it's a nice deep purple and a reasonable size and shape. No fragrance that I can detect on it, but nonetheless a nice bloom. Now before I came out here I put 7 on my list, because that's how many are in my notes. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Yeah, I love it when a plan comes together. This is my only Latoria in bloom at the moment. This is Nora Tokunaga crossed with Aberrans, but some of my other Latorias are starting spikes. I've got another Aberrans cross. Can't remember what it's crossed with, but that's got some spikes just starting as well. This is a pretty little bloom. There's no getting away from it. It is tiny, but then so's the plant. And I don't think this particular plant's going to get huge. Some of the Latorias do get pretty big. But this I think is going to stay quite a nice compact plant. The patterning and colouring is on the back of the plant, so this one's best viewed from above. And the other thing with the Latoria type dendrobiums is that blooms last absolutely ages. You know, when you're talking about really long lasting blooms, the dendrobiums are not normally in that list, but these are. These can last absolutely ages, and so do the blooms on the hibiki. So obviously the parents of hibiki have probably got long lasting blooms as well, or at least one of them must have. But yeah, so that's everything in bloom. That's it, 7 out of about 240. There are more spikes, so there are things to come. I mean, you know, but it's just that time of year. Talking to people at the Orchid societies, you know, the competition tables and the display tables have got next to nothing in them. both this month and last month really. There's just not a lot around. People have said, oh, hey, that's it, make me a liar, why don't you? I've just spotted one of the Tolumnias is in bloom, just literally opening, and that is a pretty little bloom. This lip looks like, I mean, I've done a bit of watercolour painting, and this looks like wet on wet, you know, where you put a colour on and while it's still wet you put dots of other colours on and it runs. So you get like quite a deep coloured blob fading with sort of, it's a very pretty little bloom. I've forgotten what it is. It is Jarrac Flyer Red Butterfly. Not a large bloom as Tolumnias go, but they're not, you know, some of them are tiny. Yeah, pretty little bloom. That's a recovering Tolumnia as well. But nonetheless, it's got enough roots on it to allow this bloom spike to go ahead. I mean, I'm going to start getting a bit more ruthless. If any plants that are in a state of recovery push up a spike, I'm going to take the spikes off, because I've weakened quite a few plants by letting them bloom. I'm not going to do that anymore. I've made my mind up. The blooms will come again. It's the plant that's important. If you lose the plant, you might not be able to get it again, but blooms should follow. So get the plant strong. Anyway, pretty little Tolumnia. 8. Right, as for the Sunday morning chat bit, get questions on and off at various times on various videos, and it is obvious that in the YouTube community there's quite a lot of beginners or people that are just starting out. You know, they may have many orchids, but they might not have had them that long. And I'm aware that some of the terminology gets a bit mind-boggling sometimes, so I thought I'd go over some of it. Some of this you don't even need to know really, but I mean, I use terminology. You know, in my mind, I sort of assume everybody knows what I'm talking about. But sometimes you get a question and you think, perhaps it's not so obvious. So I wanted to come back to this, and the first thing is, what's the difference between a hybrid and an intergeneric? You've heard me use the expressions. Well, a hybrid is 2 types of plants crossed. An intergeneric is 3 or more. Yeah, so you could have a cross that's nothing more than a hybrid, say an Oncidium with an Odontoglossum. Yeah, let's say, so that's just 2, so that's a hybrid. But then you cross that with, say, a Brassia crossed with an Oncidium. So suddenly you've introduced a 3rd genus into the mix. Yeah, so that would be an intergeneric. More than 2 types of orchids mixed in there somehow. And that can get quite complicated. What messes up intergenerics and turns them back into hybrids is reclassifications. So let's say what I just said. An Oncidium crossed with a Miltonia and an Odontoglossum crossed with an Oncidium. Yeah, so there's 3 in there. Yeah, 2 hybrids crossed together make an intergeneric, and then you find that nearly all the Odontoglossums have been reclassified as Oncidiums. So now you've got an Oncidium crossed with a Miltonia and an Oncidium crossed with a reclassified Odontoglossum, which is an Oncidium. So it's gone from 3 back to 2, so it's now only a hybrid. That terminology doesn't really matter, quite honestly. And then the other thing you'll get is alliance. The word is used, the Oncidium alliance, the Cattleya alliance. Yeah, well, this is a family of plants that are closely related. That's all that really means. Classic example is Cattleyas, Brassivolas, Laelias, although some of those are no longer Laelias, Sophronitis, they're nearly all reclassified as Cattleyas. But yeah, they're all in a family together. They all have similar enough traits to be classed as a family. And at the Oncidium alliance, there's quite a few in there, some of which I can't even pronounce. But Oncidium, obviously, Odontoglossums, Miltonias, Miltoniopsis, Brassias. That's sort of Oncidium alliance. And then you get some that don't have alliances, like the Dendrobiums. That is such a vast genus that's been split up into sections. So you get like the Latoria sections, which isn't actually called that, it's got its own special name. But there are dozens of those, and you don't need to know what they are, quite honestly, although sometimes it can help determine the care you ought to offer them. Yeah, so that's back at that level. The way things should be written, the genus, like Cattleya, should always have a capital letter without fail. Yeah, and that should be followed by its name. Yeah. Now, if it's a species, it should start with a lower case, and strictly speaking, it should be in italics. But you know, depends what bit of software you're using, whether you can even bother doing italics. But it should be. Yeah. And if you ever see a genus with a species name after it, and preceding that species name is a cross, an X, it means it's a natural hybrid. So although it's actually a hybrid of two species, it's not really a true man-made hybrid. It occurs naturally in the wild, and that should be written, the species name should have a small, start with a small letter, lowercase, and have an X in front of it. So if you see that, that's all that means really, a naturally occurring hybrid. I think I've got one of those. I think one of my Miltonias, Castaniae, I think that's a natural hybrid. But that's how that ought to be written. And if it's a species that's then got a named variety, then that will follow on. Yeah, and the variety names ought to be starting with capital letters really. And sometimes you'll see the word VAR, that just stands for variety really, or variation, either way. And sometimes it's just VAR with a dot. That's all that means really. What that often means is that somebody's sown a load of seeds from a species, and then you wait for them to grow on and you wait for them to bloom, and in amongst them are some special ones that the blooms are different enough to warrant getting registered as a named sort of version of it. That's all that really means. It's no big deal. But it does mean that particular type might have, say, larger blooms or slightly different coloured blooms. Yeah, and then you plant another load of seeds and get another load, and you won't get that one again. That's where the cloning comes in. Once you get a good one of something, it can actually be sent off to a laboratory and the mericloning process used, which is mashing up some parts of the plant into, well, down at virtually cell level, I think, and then growing perhaps thousands of new plants, and they'll be clones. They'll be virtually identical. So it's a way of recreating one of those special ones, perhaps produced from seed, or a cross that just worked really well. So we'll have a load of those then. Because your other alternatives, really, apart from cloning, is trying to grow from seed, which with these tropical orchids, if you haven't got a lab, is damn near impossible. Or you divide plants, you know, and if you've got a large specimen plant, you know, you might get half a dozen out of it, but that's not exactly a commercial success. But it's good for us growers to be able to pass plants on. Yeah, so that. And then the other thing you might come across is, you know, like Cattleya, followed by a name, followed by a bit in quotes. Well, again, that's a named registered cross, but a variety of it that's been given an extra name because it was that bit special. So, and quite honestly, there is no need to get bogged down with all that. There really isn't. Most of the time when you buy an orchid, especially if you're heading up near the species or primary crosses, it'll have a label on it. But I have noticed that some, even at nursery level, some people are actually spelling things wrong and actually writing them wrong. You know, they're forgetting the single quotes around the clonal name of a hybrid, for instance. I think there's a version of Sharry Baby called Sharry Baby Fragrance, I think it's called. Well, the fragrance should be in single quotes because it's a named version of Sharry Baby, which is already a cross. So that should be Oncidium with a capital letter, Sharry with a capital S, Baby with a capital B, and then Fragrance in single quotes. There is a formality to all of this. But it doesn't matter. It really doesn't matter. And other expressions related to the plants themselves, you'll hear me talk about fans. Well, Tolumnias have fans, yeah? They have a growth that from the base forms a fan, yeah? So it's a flat set of leaves in a fan shape. That's all that is. I mean, that's not even a technical term, it's just an expression. What else? Neophonetas tend to have fans on them. You could class that as a giant fan, but not really. It's not the same sort of thing. And then obviously you've got pseudobulbs and canes, and so, sometimes they can look very similar. I mean, if you take, let me find one. If you take that Dendrobium cane, yeah, well, apart from these lower leaves, that can look quite similar to a pseudobulb. But it's mainly the type of plant that will determine whether you're talking about canes or pseudobulbs. I mean, these are obviously pseudobulbs, yeah? These are obviously canes, and they can be various shapes from long and skinny to funny little fat bits. So that's that sort of thing. Leaves on plants. It doesn't really come into play unless you're talking about a type of plant that only has a certain trait to it, like cattleyas are normally monofoliate, single leaf, or bifoliate, pairs of leaves. But every now and again you'll get a pseudobulb with 3, or you'll get a plant that's got some with 1 and some with 2, and then an odd one comes up with 3. So certainly in amongst the hybrids, the genetics are getting in there sometimes and playing games. But it's nothing to worry about. A bifoliate that puts up a pseudobulb with a single leaf isn't dying. It's not the end of the world. It's just harping back to some trait that got in that cross. You know, it happens in the animal world as well. You've got a black cat and it happens to escape and meets up with another black cat, and you get kittens. In theory, they should be black. In amongst them, you can get a white one. Yeah, well, same sort of thing happens with plants. They just harp back to a trait from a species back in somewhere in that hybrid. What else? Mat forming. Dendrobium lodigesii in its natural growing state will form a mat. This is not a common trait with orchids, I must admit, but some do have that growth habit where the canes that they push out tend to hug the ground, and then they can produce little plants. I mean, this one had loads of little plants. You can call them kikis or plantlets. There is really a difference, but it's only a terminology. It doesn't matter what you call them. But these lodigesii can often produce a number of plantlets along the cane. And because it's ground hugging, those plants' roots will get down into whatever it's growing on or in amongst and form new little plants. In such a case that if the main plant was lost for some reason, those little plants perpetuate its survival. Yeah, so there's that sort of trait. And then the other thing you might hear talked about is rhizomes, and this is where you get a plant where the bulbs on the plant have got a noticeable gap. Now, some types of orchids have rhizomes that you can't even see. So that's a bulbophyllum. That's a classic plant that has rhizomes, some of which can be a pain. But there's a little join between each pseudobulb. That's the rhizome. Yeah? And some of those are so short that you can't hardly see them. The bulbs almost seem to be touching, but nonetheless there is a rhizome there. And then you can get some extremes in amongst that group. If you look at that bulbophyllum there, the rhizomes on that are 2 inches long. And that type of plant is a pain, because it'll grow out of your pot. It'll head off over the edge out into space. That's just the nature of the way they grow. What else in terminology? It's not a lot really, and a lot of it's just a way of talking about parts of plants so that people know what you mean. That's all it is, really. I mean, roots you get. There's obviously terrestrial type of orchids. Those roots are down in the ground or buried in the leaf litter, that sort of thing. If you're going to grow them, they do like to be in the dark. It's their nature. They don't need light near the roots. And they don't need huge amounts of air around the roots either. They're a ground growing orchid, so they're best kept in dark pots for a start and not let the light in. Sometimes it doesn't do them any harm, and I mean I've seen Paphiopedilums grown in net baskets. That's not their natural way of growing, although some of them do grow with exposed roots. But a lot of them, you know, when you find one of those types of plants in the wild, you can't see the roots. They're buried in something, even if it's growing on a rocky cliff face. The little niche that plant's found has got some debris in there somewhere, so the roots are, you know, normally covered up. Most of the ones we talk about and grow are epiphytes, which just means they live on another plant but do not harm it. They're not a parasite. There's a distinct difference. They do it no harm. They just use it as a place to live. Yeah, that's all. And the roots will attach to the branches, the twigs, the trunks, all that sort of thing. And in amongst those, there are some that prefer to be on bare bark. You don't find them very often growing in real mossy places and in amongst other plants and that sort of thing. They like a little bit of space to themselves. And others you only ever find growing in amongst that moss and, you know, roots of other plants and things like that. But they're still epiphytes. They're still growing on another plant without directly taking any, you know, being parasitic. So that's that. And you find most epiphytes, with exceptions, are going to like a wet-dry cycle because they get rained on and their roots are almost bare, so they dry out pretty quick. But that's not always the case. I mean, strictly speaking, Draculas are epiphytes, but most of those are found growing in loose moss, sometimes not even attached to a tree. Just that you know, the moss has sort of grown and started to dangle down from the branches, and the Draculas will hang in there. So they're only just hanging on by the skin of their teeth. But nonetheless, you know, they're not terrestrials in the true sense. So yeah, so that's just a bit of terminology. I'm sure I've missed a couple of bits, but here's another mat forming one. You know, when I talk about that sort of thing, it's a creeper. Yeah. So although it's an epiphyte, it likes to move away from its base. It heads off in all flipping directions. That is Dinema polybulbum. I think it was epidendrum once, which makes more sense to me, but I don't even know what a dinema is. But again, that's the renaming. This one looks like it's going to bloom soon as well. Got some sheaths popping up in places. So that's that type of thing. And then you'll get other types of plants that are monopodial. They have a base to them, and the leaves grow away from that base. There's no true cane. There might be a stem. I mean, a cattleya, yeah, for instance, there is a distinct stem, but it's only got one base, unless it forms a kiki, like this one. This has got a new little plant growing near the base. Well, not growing very well, but it's growing. Yeah, so, you know, a long stem. A phalaenopsis is in the same category. Now, that hasn't got a long stem, but it has got one. Yeah. The Arengus, yeah, again, a little tiny plant with a base to it. Now this one grows new plants out the side. But again, strictly speaking, that's not a kiki, it's growing from the base. Kiki tends to be something, it's used most often for dendrobium types that have got canes. And the new plant that comes out from some way up the cane, sometimes right at the top of the cane, that's not the same thing as that. That's a new plant growing from the base. But you can call it a kiki if you want, it's not technically wrong. Another little Arengus there. That's got several plants. 1, 2, 3, I think there's 4 plants there, but there's only one base. So it's like a clump. Another expression that you could use to describe that sort of plant. It's a clump. Yeah. Term normally used for things in your garden, but you know, it's transferable. Anyway, that's enough of me waffling. I've got quite a bit to do today. Yeah, so some of the terminologies used. I mean, I use my own expressions for types of roots. You get very fine root systems, you get fragile root systems, look at them and they break, that sort of thing. Big chunky fat roots, roots that attach readily, and some plants seem happier to chuck out aerial roots, and others just die to get hold of something. I mean, this is a classic one. Although this does push out some aerial roots, most of the aerial roots on this is because it's grown off of the mount. But you can see it has a tendency that any root that gets anywhere near that mount grabs hold of it, good and firm. This one's even punched a hole through the mount and come out the back. And you often find with ones that have that tendency to grab hold of really tight like that, they often flatten. As soon as they attach, they flatten so that they get a wider surface on whatever they're growing on. Mount in this case. And as I say, others seem to be hanging on to their mounts or their trees and branches in the wild with so few roots. You think, God, a gust of wind would have that one down, but they don't. They hang on there. But there is some chains of thought say that if a plant's being newly establishing itself, it will push out roots towards what it's hanging on to secure it first before it pushes out aerial roots to take nutrients and moisture from the air. In my mind, that's cobblers. Plants don't think. They push out roots in random directions. Those that come up against something will attach. Those that hang in the air will be aerial roots. And that's just it. It's the same in the pot. People have said, oh, the roots always head to the edge of the pot. No, they don't. They head out in a random direction. And what do they come up against? The edge of the pot. And the only way is round it. That's the only reason you get roots going round and round inside a pot, is because they've got nowhere else to go. And some of those with extensive root systems will find your drainage holes and go out the bottom and head off into space that way. But that's the only reason you find roots going round a pot, is because they run out of places to go. And they grow away from the base of the plant. So the natural, if your plant's in the middle of a pot, they're going to head away from it and downwards. They just come out in a random direction and head off into whatever they can find. So I don't believe a plant can say, I'm not very secure, I'll push out more roots in that direction so I can hang on. I don't think that ability's there, really. It's wishful thinking, perhaps. I could be wrong. Some scientist is going to come up and this experiment showed this, that and the other. Well, let me know. I'm always open to suggestions. Combination of the very little in bloom and a bit of a chat about some of the terminology used. But quite a lot of the terms I just use them because they're plant terms. They're not even specific to orchids, really. And there's no need to get bogged down with it all. As I say, certainly species and primary crosses should have a tag on them with the appropriate names correctly written in most cases. But you will buy a plant that has a tag in it with a bright, pretty picture of a flower, and it'll just say orchid. And sometimes even what it is not obvious. I've seen Miltonias for sale with a tag that said orchid next to oncidiums for sale that just say orchid. Well, yeah, they're in the same alliance, yes, but they're not the same plant, although their treatment's pretty similar. That's the important bit. Yeah, I think the important bit is keeping it alive and getting it to thrive. Worry about what it's called if ever you need to tell somebody else. Otherwise, it's one of my orchids. This is one of my pretty orchids. That'll do, Don't have to be a flipping scientist or a chemist or anything like that. Just plants at the end of the day, although they do have certain special requirements. But then so do some other plants. Orchids are not unique in that. Anyway, I will see you next time. I'm out all day Tuesday. It's tomorrow. Tomorrow's Monday. I've got a little bit of repotting to do tomorrow that'll be a bit different, so I'll film that. There's a clue. There's my cold coffee as well. Yeah, I've been waiting for those to enable me to do something, so that'll be tomorrow. And anybody watching this that can get near somewhere to watch, 4 o'clock UK time this afternoon, Rachel's doing a live broadcast with William Green from My Green Pets. So you've got two channels coming together for a live broadcast, and it's at the time of day when I'll be awake. So I'm hoping to be there. But drop along, say hi. You know, it's good stuff. So that's today. And I'm out all day Tuesday. Wednesday I've got a travelling day, pick my daughter up and get my stuff ready for my little break. And Thursday's my travel day. I'm off. And I won't be back until the following Tuesday. But who knows? I may pop up somewhere while I'm away. Who knows? See you next time.